Are you a 3D VTuber? And are you ready for the next 3D VTuber meta, which is gonna be very stretchy and squishy? Hi, it's your friendly neighborhood VTuber Suvi here with a new tutorial. Today we're going to look into a new feature that you could use to improve your 3D VTubers tracking. And this feature is called stretch bones. So, what are stretch bones? They're basically a system that allows you to adjust a specific stretch bone based on anchor and a target bone. Now, if your avatar has been built with stretch bone in mind, you could do a lot of various kinds of things, including moving muscles in your avatar and so on. But even if your avatar has not really specifically been made for the stretch bone system, you can still use it to do something similar to what I have on my avatar right now, which is basically reacting to stretches and then also supporting squishes, like so. And the stretch bones can of course also affect blend shape values, especially in VNyan. So today you will need the very latest version of VNyan that supports the new stretch bone system. And that's probably all you will need. The system should work even with Vroid models, and in many cases it will work with non-Vroid models as well. However, in some cases you may need to do small edits to your avatar in case the outfit and the skin tend to start to overlap. But that should be relatively simple to fix. Anyway, let's get to it, shall we? Okay, so now that you have VNyan opened up and you have loaded up your avatar in the application, the first step you probably should do is set some kind of arm angle for your tracking so that your avatar is kind of in a natural A pose. So for me, I have set these arms to be basically around 57 degrees. You could set them to like 60 as well, depending on what looks nice with your avatar's outfit. Okay, now once you have all of that set correctly, the next thing is you could click the new stretch bones button that we have added in the most recent version of VNyan. Now, by default, it opens up a completely empty window. And now when we click the add bone, it gives us a lot of fields, and this may look a bit intimidating at first. But as we go through it today, that will hopefully become a little bit clearer. So let's first go through what is a stretch bone. So stretch bone basically, in VNyan, calculates the distance between anchor point and target bone, and then it counts the distance between those two bones. And that value will then affect possibly a scale value, a positional value, or even a blend shape value. So you could use this to do a lot of stuff if your avatar was actually built with stretch bone system in mind. However, to the rest of us who probably don't have avatars built with this thing in mind, we could still do some additional things with this. Let's say you want to do a stretch and squish of your avatar's booba bones, for example, which is probably going to be the most common use case for this system. So how do we get started creating that? We will first of all need to do a bone for both sides. So let's start with the left bone. So we're gonna just give this a name, like so. And now we are going to set first the anchor object. Now the anchor object can be usually any kind of bone. The target object, on the other hand, or target bone, should in most cases be a humanoid bone. And then finally the stretch bone should be anything but a humanoid bone. So in our case, we're probably gonna keep both the anchor and the stretch bone as the first booba bone. And then the target is gonna be our upper arm, and then we are going to adjust the positional offset so that the offset will be somewhere in the upper arm, but not exactly the upper arm, but slightly towards the elbow. So let's start by picking up our anchor object. So we'll just click on the icon here. It will open this search box where we can just type the bones. And our avatar has 2 bones per each side, so we're gonna pick the first bone. Now we can also show the objects. And this will show a small box in a different color depending on what bone it means. So the anchor is showing up in blue. Now the target object is what we're gonna pick next. So for that, in our avatar, we're gonna pick the upper arm bone, which is this one. And now our upper arm is here. Now the problem with this method is that if I was now to move the arms, and we can test it by adjusting the arm angle. If I was now to move this, as you can see, the distance doesn't change at all because our upper arm bone is basically stationary. So in a way, this wouldn't really do anything right now. So how do we get around this? We can add positional offset to this target bone. So we could, for example, set here some kind of value and see what happens. Now, this moved it forward, so this is not the axis we need to use. So let's try x next. So let's say like 0.2. And now as we can see, it moved to the wrong direction. So let's set that to negative 0.2. So now we have the bone somewhere not quite at the elbow. And now if we were to move this value, you can see that the stretch value actually changes. So the higher we take it, the more it becomes, and then as we bring it more towards our usual, it becomes smaller. So let's set this to 60. So now we have already set the bones that we will use to affect the distance. However, there is also a rotational offset. So currently, when things are configured, the default values are read in a T-pose. So if we set this rotation to 0, you can see that the stretch values are now exactly 1. But we probably don't want this to start affecting things. Like let's say if we want to do a squish, so we want to move the booba bones towards the center of the avatar. If we were to use this value, then already when we would start moving from the T-pose, things would start moving, which is not what we want. So we should be able to specify a rotational offset of, in this case, probably 60. So we need to actually write that here. Now I do not personally remember which of these axes we need to use, but let's try the Z first. So we're gonna set the same rotation as we have here to here. So let's see what happens if we do this. And now, as you can see, the values went to 1. This means that right now we have the correct rotation. So now if we were to start decreasing this, as you can see, the stretch values get smaller, which would indicate a squish. And then when we go above it, that would mean a stretch, like so. Let's set this back to 60. So the next thing we could do, of course, is make sure that our target positional offset is what we exactly want it to be. This 0.2 might be too much. We could set it to 0.1 instead, and this would still work just fine. The next step would be to decide what do we want to do. A very common thing would be that when we move our arms up, we would actually stretch the booba upwards a little bit. So how would we do that? First of all, we would need to use the scale values for that. Now we have some scale values already defined here, but before we can do anything, we should set the stretch bone. So for this, we are going to use the same booba bone that we used as the anchor. So now you can see a green dot appeared at the same spot as where we had the anchor. Now, if we were to move this, you can see that something really weird happens right now. So we have kind of like a scaling going on here, but not exactly what we wanted to do, obviously. So we can start setting up some values. First of all, we do not want the booba to stretch sideways more than this current size. So we could set the X max value here to 1. So this means that the booba will only stretch along the x-axis to its usual size. So now if we were to scale this, as you can see, it only changes along the y value. But it does squeeze down a little bit, like so. But we should probably also not make it squish along the y-axis when we go to the negative value. At least not this much. So we have an option. We can either set this to 1, or we should actually set it to something less than 1. Something like that. So now, as you can see, when we do this, it will in fact not squish that much downwards. However, upwards it does squish quite a bit. Or not squish, but scale. We could limit this, of course, by adjusting multipliers. But obviously this is not fully the effect we want. We do also not want this value to scale outwards, like it does currently, which means we should also limit the z-axis to 1. And as you can see, it doesn't really scale upwards anymore. Now, we probably also don't want it to really scale anyway. So we could limit both of these sides to 1, like so. So what do we actually want to happen now? We could go and look at the other values we have here. If we want something to happen to the booba bone when we move our arms up, we probably should first of all decrease the amount it scales, because we can already see a small issue here when the arms are moving upwards. This is because the scaling in our model is affecting certain vertices and causing this small gap here. So we don't want it to scale that much. So we should decrease the scale multiplier value. You'd set it to, let's try 0.5 first and see how that looks like. I think it still scales a little bit too much. So let's decrease it even further, like so. Okay, now we have some scaling going on, which looks quite okay. But of course the scaling is not really enough, because right now it looks weird. So what should instead happen is that the booba bone should actually move upwards a little bit. And that we can do by changing the move amount a little bit. So let's see what we can do. Currently, we have a move offset set to the y-axis of -1. That is a good point, because then, as we are currently capping the minimum value to 1, then the move offset is first -1. So by default, we will have it remain at the original spot. And then at maximum we will add 1, because this says 2 minus 1 equals 1. So now we could add some move amount. Let's start with something quite small and see what happens. That's actually not small enough, it seems. But the idea remains. So as you can see, it moves up. But yes, the amount is way too much right now. So let's try 0.01 and see what happens. It's already pretty good. I would probably move it up so that this bottom side of the booba bone doesn't actually move downwards at all. So we could increase this a little bit. Let's try 15. It still moves downwards a little bit, so let's increase it to 0.02. I would say right now it looks pretty decent. We can still see a slight issue of the outline on the top of the booba, and to fix that we should probably lower the scale multiplier a little bit until we find a point where it doesn't cause issues. Right now it actually looks pretty decent. So now as we lift our arms up, the booba bone kind of stretches bigger and moves upwards. And as we come back to here, the booba scales smaller along the x-axis. Now this doesn't really look like a squish yet because the boobas don't move towards the center. So how do we do this then? We still have not touched the actual movement along the x-axis. So we could try to adjust the x-axis next. So as we can see, when the arms move smaller, the x value moves smaller. So we could try setting something to this value as well. Let's set 0.01 and see what happens. Now I do imagine right now the direction is wrong. So they actually move outwards. So now if we flip this to minus, this doesn't yet really show like it's doing anything. So let's make it a bigger value. See if we can get something working. Now, as we can see, they are actually moving inwards. Now, what you will want to make sure of, though, when you are moving the bones is what's to the sides. And make sure that there is no clipping. Now, you will probably see a lot of clipping similar to this if you're working on a Vroid avatar. But what you can do in Vroid is obviously remove the skin underneath the clothes if that is a possible use case for you. If it's not a possibility, then you will have to limit the movement. So in this case, we could decrease this amount a little bit until we find a value where there is no clipping. Of course, you should also take into account the possible place where your arms even can be. This current 90-degree angle is probably something you will want to avoid in your tracking anyway. So think of a possible angle. I'm guessing 70 degrees is more closer to what you might usually have. So now, as you can see, everything kind of works with this system. So now what we would want to do next is clone this mechanic for the right side as well. So let's go and do that. And this is really easy to do. We can just export this bone and then import it again. And then we will need to flip some of these angles first. So let's try that. I shall click the export bone next and then export it, and then let's see what happens next. And once we have exported it, we just click the import bone and then point it to the same file we just exported. Okay, now that it has imported, we will select the new bone. First of all, let's rename it to right, like so. And then we want it to point to the right bones. And because on my avatar, they are exactly the same name with just the L changed to R, we will do it like this. Now, you will already see that the sizing is wrong and the bones are in wrong places. So we will first need to make sure that the target offset is actually going the right way. So in this one, we need to flip this minus to positive. And now you can see that the bone is in the correct place. Next, we can try the angle, and as you can see, it misbehaves right now. So the target angle should probably also be flipped, like so. Now we can already see the movement upwards is the same, but the movement sideways seems wrong, which means that we will also need to flip the move amount along the x-axis around. like so. Okay, so now basically everything is working more or less. So try different values and see what works the best for you. I hope this tutorial was useful for you. And if you run into any questions about this system, just hop into our Discord server, and there is a good place to ask assistance on how to use this system. If you have any requests for new tutorials, then also feel free to type that in the comment section below. I will definitely consider that in the future videos. Anyway, cuties, see you next time. Bye bye!